Okay, says we're live now. Hey everybody, we are up to week 11 on vocab, and this week's words are kind of drama related, meaning they'll have to do with some of the plays that we're going to be reading, namely the one coming up, which is Oedipus Rex. Actually, you'll hear me tie a lot of these words here to Gatsby as well, because I think the character of Gatsby actually ties to many of the words. But let's get her going here. And sorry, this is always there's always a delay here. And let's switch these out for you. There we go. So how about if I actually start on slide number 1? Oh, that's just my introductory slide. So our first word is tragedy. Tragedy, probably a word that you have heard before. Tragedy actually translates to mean goat song, and it's kind of a weird translation, but historically, goats were often given as prizes in competitions where there would be plays and you'd put your play against somebody else's play. It was like a play competition or a drama competition. Goats were also used as a sort of ritual sacrifice. So perhaps a play occurred and then there was a sacrifice at the end and the goat was used. And these were most often used with tragedies, which is why, it translates to goat song. So enough about the history. Let me tell you that a drama is based on human suffering, and we often in a tragedy have the downfall of the main character, which makes me think about Gatsby, as y'all know is my favorite, because we certainly have his downfall at the end of the book. It also often involves catharsis, which is a word that's going to be coming up. And basically it means where the audience feels something towards the character. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but a tragedy should invoke human suffering. We have the downfall of the main character, who is often a tragic hero, another one of our words. And a tragedy should invoke catharsis in us as the audience. Hang on for those definitions. The next one is tragic hero. And I kind of put the slide together like this because these are kind of the key characteristics when we have a tragic hero. So first of all, a tragic hero is a person who has greater than normal stature. So meaning they could be more noble, more attractive, they could be smarter kind of than the average Joe. There's something about them that is greater than the average person. And the other characteristic that they typically have is there's the sense of goodness about them, that they're a good human, they're likable, and which makes their downfall later on even more tragic. That's one of the kind of important things there. The tragic hero has a tragic flaw, some sort of flaw. That could be ignorance, right? Not knowing something. It could be a number of things. We're going to talk about the term hamartia, and hamartia is another term for kind of a tragic flaw, and I'll give you some more examples of different possible flaws when I talk about hamartia. So because of that tragic flaw, often that character can't see something. Again, not so much physically, but it's the inability to realize something. And so they have what we call this fall from grace. They fall from their station of power. They fall from respect, or they fall from goodness. And we start to feel bad for the character because often what happens to them, they don't entirely deserve. Sometimes they couldn't help it, or it wasn't their fault. And so we, as the audience, feel for the hero. They have this tragic flaw, there's this realization, and they fall from grace. And we feel kind of pity for them, often because they didn't deserve what ultimately happens to them. So that is kind of a little bit of the tragic hero. Often, tragic hero is often a male, most often a male. The tragic hero at the end of the story doesn't always have to die, but sometimes he does. But there's always kind of something that happens to him at the end of the story that we would keep using that word tragic, but that would be considered tragic. So hamartia, I think this is a term that is new for you, and this is a term we talk about a lot. Literally, the term hamartia means to miss the mark or to fall short of an objective, but often we use it to mean a tragic or a fatal flaw that leads to the downfall of a character. It's often an error resulting from ignorance, some sort of error in judgment, a flaw in their character, or a sin. Both Hamlet and Oedipus have really obvious examples of hamartias or fatal flaws. I put that it's a noun there because sometimes this is a weird word to think about, like how to use this word. Other examples of fatal flaws could be excessive loyalty, indecisiveness, passionate burning love, a term called hubris, which we're going to talk about shortly, rage, stinginess, excessive ambition. So there's a lot of different examples of this, but some sort of a fatal flaw is what we think of with hamartia. So hubris is actually one of the most common examples of a fatal flaw, and hubris is simply excessive pride or excessive confidence. And often what happens when someone has, hubris is that they almost lose contact with reality. And so, they're so high in the clouds, they feel so proud and confident that there's not really a sense of reality anymore. And this is actually a really common fatal flaw. So I use this term catharsis, and you might have heard this term used. You say something's cathartic, and if something's cathartic, it's basically kind of a release of emotion. And when we talk about the audience experiencing catharsis in a play, you sort of release or purge your emotions. You feel for the tragic hero. Another way to think of it's kind of like an emotional discharge, right? Like everything comes out, and it is often therapeutic. So I've found a couple of cartoons here that kind of illustrate this. Here's like therapy, here's catharsis, because all these feelings just come out, right? And here there's like clearly rage, and they're breaking down the doors and whatnot. So you can actually think about what's cathartic in your own life, right? If you have a stressful week at school, you got a million projects and papers, what's your catharsis? How do you purge your emotions? What's cathartic for you at the end of the week? For some of you, maybe just like a hot bubble bath, trying to like get rid of and stop thinking about what happened in the week. For some of you, it might be, could be an act of violence, right? And hopefully it's not hurting anybody, but you need like a physical release. Maybe it's just burying yourself in kind of the world of television and getting out of your world. So there's going to be a lot of different things that we consider cathartic. So chorus. So with this word, you probably think about it most often in relation to music. And it's not that much different when we talk about it in tragedy and in dramas. But basically a chorus in a play, like we're going to be thinking about it, it's a group of characters in a play, and they're going to show up to comment on the action, but they don't participate in it. So they kind of act as a voice of the people in a way, to recap a scene, to give us kind of a heads up on what's going to happen, but they never participate in the action. They always just kind of comment on it. You see that the people in these pictures look very strange. They're wearing masks. And this is something we're going to talk more about in class, because wearing masks is sort of a tradition in ancient theater. And we'll get to that more in class, but that's why these people look so weird and kind of creepy. Okay, an aside is the next one we're up to. So an aside in a play is a brief remark that's directed to the audience, and it's not meant to be heard by other, actors or characters on stage. Usually it lets the audience know what a character is about to do or what a character is thinking. And often, like in this example, in this Romeo and Juliet example, it says aside, so that you as a reader know that, again, like Juliet's not supposed to hear Romeo say that. He's really kind of thinking that out loud to himself, and she's not meant to hear it. Soliloquy. This is a word we will be very familiar with when we read Hamlet, because Hamlet has some very, very famous soliloquies. Most notably, the to be or not to be soliloquy is probably the most famous one of all time. And a soliloquy, they're mainly found in Shakespeare's plays. They're presented by a single character who's often alone on the stage. Soliloquies are not meant to be heard by other characters. They're basically given to oneself. They're, Hamlet is talking to himself out loud in this to be or not to be soliloquy. And basically what he's doing is he's verbalizing his internal thoughts. It's his inner voice. So you as the audience are clued into what he's thinking, even though he's really doing it for himself. He's not delivering it to you. But it allows us to better understand the characters internally, right? Because through dialogue or through the way that plays are written, you often don't get kind of this narrator explaining all the time. And so soliloquies are one way that we can kind of get into the mind of the characters a little bit more. A monologue is often a term that gets confused with soliloquy, because a monologue is also presented by a single character. And one of the main differences is that a monologue is meant to express thoughts to the audience. It's like you're letting the audience in on kind of your secret, if you will. So I don't know if you've heard of this, but like a few years ago, this really popular book came out, The Vagina Monologues. And they were performed kind of at colleges across the country, and of course, it's a little bit racy and whatnot, but essentially there's all these little monologues that people would present. There'd be programs, and you'd go see the Vagina Monologues. It was something we did in college, from like different perspectives, like having to do with women, reproductive issues, and those kinds of things. But it's really, again, to express thoughts to an audience in a play or in a theater, versus a soliloquy where that actor is really, that character is presenting their thoughts. It's their own thoughts. It's not meant to clue the audience in, it's just to verbalize their internal thoughts. Nemesis. So this is a term you've probably heard. Most often it's associated with superheroes, but nemesis translates to mean to give what is due. And Nemesis is actually also a Greek goddess of revenge. So when we think of Nemesis, there's really two things we should think about. A nemesis could be kind of like your thorn in your side, a rival or an opponent that's not easily overcome, or sometimes is never overcome. So when we think about some of the famous superheroes, often they have a nemesis, right, who continues to return and return and kind of plague them. Because the superheroes are the protagonists, we also have antagonists, right? Like the Joker is the antagonist, and therefore would be Batman's nemesis. A nemesis can also be seen as a situation. Like a nemesis would be a situation or change that one cannot triumph over, something like you can't overcome. So it can be a situation as well. It doesn't have to be a person. Aristotelian tragedy. So we'll talk about Sophocles, who's the author of Oedipus Rex, and we'll kind of mention Aristotle, who was also alive kind of around the same time. And to kind of keep things simple, Aristotle said there are 6 elements that need, or 6 principles, I guess, that need to be present for something to be considered tragedy. And these were the 6 that he laid out. So he said that a tragic hero, which then there's a tragic hero in the story, must be royal, noble, or considered great. And we saw that as a characteristic of a tragic hero as well. Somehow the tragic hero must be imperfect. That allows us as the audience to relate to the character. If the tragic hero is perfect, we can't relate because none of us are perfect human beings. And so that imperfection in the tragic hero allows us as an audience to relate. They're similar to the average person then, in essence. The third characteristic he said was that nearly every character the tragic hero is close to is affected as a result of a decision. That one's pretty self-explanatory. I don't want to give you too much more of an example because, again, when we get to Oedipus, I kind of want you to think about how this plays out within the course of that story. 4, the tragic hero is going to receive some sort of punishment. And again, that punishment or the consequence, I guess, the tragic hero receives is often harsher than what we believe he deserves. In that punishment or in that consequence, there's often some sort of a loss, but that loss leads to a gain, and that gain is often some sort of a learning, some sort of knowledge or awareness that the tragic hero did not have before. And then finally, the last characteristic says that the reader experiences catharsis, that purging of emotion, right, where we feel for the tragic hero and what he has had to go through. Again, we're going to kind of apply these ideas in class if there's anything that's confusing right now. So that takes us to the end of our presentation for today. As always, bring questions to class on Tuesday, and we'll be in Oedipus enough by then that maybe some of this will start to actually make sense as you apply it. We'll see you soon.